All right. What is the truth behind modern migration? Where do we start?
There isn't one type of migrant, I guess. So you have the international student who wants to acquire education overseas. You have family migrant who wants to join family or get married. You have the labor migrant who wants to find better jobs. And then you have, refugees and asylum seekers who are forced to actually move. And each type of migrant has their own set of reasons. So what compels somebody to leave their country?
There's such a wide variety of motives and drivers and factors that no single theory of migration has ever been able to capture them all, and never will.
I think that's a very interesting point, because I think there is a misconception that we can, as researchers, predict exactly, migration numbers and say, how many are going to come.
Yeah, when even the richest countries have trouble getting the precise numbers right.
Yes, exactly.
So it's starting from an uncertain baseline.
You're already starting from an uncertain measurement. You don't have theories to help you because it's so vast and complex a problem, and then you're looking into a process that is so volatile that prediction is just impossible.
Something good about the research that's going on here is that on our side we're looking very quantitatively. What can we see statistics of people moving? What can we measure about those areas in terms of density of conflicts, economic activity, environmental factors, and see what are the patterns that explain that.
I guess there are so many misconceptions about migration. And I think this is why people think that modern migration now is so different, while in reality might not be different from the past.
And then people themselves change the way they see themselves. The person becomes a citizen of both country of origin and destination, so their identity combines the two elements, which is something that has been looked at since for a few decades now, but now is becoming more important than ever, I think.
So good evening and welcome to the British Academy, and for those of you watching us online via the live stream, welcome. We're pleased that you've come to join us. Now, before I go any further, I'm sure a lot of people are thinking, Jason Cowley looks much older in person than I think he should be, and perhaps even more bald than I expect him to be. But unfortunately, Jason isn't with us. He's unable to come because he's editor-in-chief of the New Statesman. With all that's going on in Westminster and also in Brussels, he's trying to put a magazine to bed tonight as late as possible, whilst being as contemporary as possible. And we're proud of him. He's an alumnus of the University of Southampton, and we're very disappointed he couldn't make it. But we completely understand and hope the magazine goes well, and we'll see him again soon. But tonight is about these two gentlemen, and you're not really here to see or hear me, but my name is Charles Elder. I'm the Media Relations Manager for the university, and I'm very pleased to step into the breach at the last minute. Tonight is about migration and immigration. We have a series of lectures we've been running for 3 years now. They've been very successful, very popular, and very pleased to see a good audience here tonight. They've been on various themes over the last couple of years, but this year we focused on migration and immigration as a broad theme, and tonight looking at uncertainties and complexities around migration itself. And these two gentlemen have got a lot of experience, but before we get to them, I'll do a little bit of housekeeping and just say, you can keep your phones on, just turn them on silent, because we want you to tweet. We have a hashtag tonight, UOS Lectures, so UOSLECTURES, and that will get you into the conversation if you want to make comments throughout the evening. We will be taking questions. If anybody's watching online and would like to inject a question from afar, somewhere in the Twitter sphere, they'd be more than welcome, and we'll put those forward later on when we get to the audience participation aspect. But tonight is really focused on trying to unravel some of the mysteries, some of the questions we all have. And in discussing before we started this evening, we were saying how in some ways when you start to talk about migration or start to think about issues, you're really thinking possibly from a negative perspective. At least the general public might be. And I know I have misconceptions and things I've spoken to Jakob about, and thinking maybe I need to learn some more lessons about what's really going on myself. So I'm really looking forward to having some of my misconceptions and maybe some of the myths busted this evening. So let me introduce who we have in front of you. We have Professor Jakob Wiak. And Jakob is a professor of statistical demography at the University of Southampton. He has 17 years experience in academia and international civil service, and his research is mainly focused on demographic uncertainty, population models and forecasts, and the demography of armed conflict. He's currently leading a European Research Council project on Bayesian agent-based population studies, developing innovative simulation models of migration, and he co-leads the Economic and Social Research Council Center for Population Change Modeling Strand. And John Simmons is Deputy Director for Analysis on Migration and Border Policy in the Home Office Analysis and Insight Directorate. He spent more than 2 decades working in social policy analysis, providing advice across government and internationally, and he is, in his current role, John oversees the publication and development of the Immigration Statistics and Research Reports. He also works closely with the Office for National Statistics and others involved in producing data on migration, and provides analytical advice to Home Office policymakers and ministers. So join me in welcoming them to the stage. Now, tonight's format is slightly different than one we've used before in this series of public lectures. We've generally had people stand up, give a presentation, then a panel discussion, and interaction from the audience. So tonight, it's more of a conversation. And it's an opportunity for us to explore some issues, as I said, myth-busting, trying to get under the skin of some of the questions you have a little bit later on. But we'll start by asking Jakob and then John to tell us a little bit more about themselves and kind of set the tone for the discussion tonight, kind of lay out their view of migration from their own perspective. So Jakob, if you start us.
Thank you. And good evening to everyone. I think I'll go straight through to talking about migration rather than talking about myself, because you've introduced me really, really kindly. So I'd like to talk about the academic view on migration, on the complexity and uncertainty of migration. So when we look at migration from the academic point of view, we're looking at a process that's very difficult to analyze, to predict, and to control. So I'd like to give some reasons as to why this is the case. I'd like to focus on uncertainty and complexity as the 2 defining features of contemporary migration. And we'll look at this based on the expertise in different areas of migration studies. And also, what we'll also discuss is the questions that need asking when we are thinking about designing migration policies. So let's start with uncertainty. Uncertainty in the world of migration is everywhere. Migration is a demographic process that's probably the most volatile and the most multidimensional of the different aspects of population change. And we are no better in predicting migration now than we were, say, a generation ago. Back then, everyone was expecting the UK to lose people through migration, which did not happen. And similarly, the forecast of the net inflow of the new citizens of the new EU member states made just before the European Union enlargement in 2004 were too short by an order of magnitude as compared to what actually happened. Most recently, the Syrian asylum crisis also had very vast elements of unpredictability to it too. So why is this the case? To start with, as Charles already mentioned, the data, the information that we have about migration is problematic. So the definitions that we use are ambiguous and can be confusing, especially in the public discourse. So who are migrants? Who are refugees? Who are asylum seekers? These terms have them properly defined meaning, but they very often get confused and conflated with each other. The tools that we use to measure migration also do not often reflect either these definitions that we may think of, or the reality on the ground. And besides, there are many errors in the data as well. In the UK, the situation is compounded by the country not having a population register, as is the case in many other countries on the European continent. So that leads to needing to assemble, for example, a pile of utility bills from 5 years to prove residence rights, which can be quite cumbersome exercise. The key policy challenge is, what information do we need? What information do policymakers need in order to make the best informed decisions, and then how to obtain this information? Finally, the part of the complexity of migration links to the many dimensions and many phases of it. Different people, different groups move or stay for many different yet interrelated reasons. And the drivers of migration are ultimately about differences in income, in employment, in security, in educational prospects, but also differences in opportunity. And there is no single explanation of migration or theory of migration, and possibly there never can be. Migration flows have their own dynamics, and their drivers, the underpinning network of factors contributing to migration flows, do not respond swiftly to migration policies. And here we get to the crux of the matter. So a fundamental defining feature of human migration is actually human agency, so free will, if you will. Migrants are autonomous agents or actors who make informed decisions based on the information that we have. But it's not only migrants who are actors in the migration processes. The intermediaries, employers, smugglers, various institutions also play a role, and they have their own agency, and so do the policymakers. And the different agents, the different actors have their different goals, sometimes explicit, sometimes not, but very often contradicting with one another. And the important lesson here is that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to managing the different kinds of migration flows that we can think of. And one thing worth remembering here is that ultimately these are not policymakers who make decisions about migrations, it's the migrants who do. And policymakers and other actors, intermediaries, provide information to inform these decisions. The decisions are made under conditions of uncertainty. And very often, as we've seen in the case of the recent asylum crisis, the policies, prohibitive policies of nation states are seen as prospective migrants just as yet another barrier or barriers to bypass and overcome. So in a sense, the policies are treated by migrants as a given in the equation that leads to the decision to migrate or not. Other times, migrants may deliberately put their decision on hold until the options become clearer. And this is something that increases the uncertainty even further. And what happens if we have high levels of uncertainty? So if uncertainty to migrants is very high, they do not have much stakes in integrating with the host society. And although on other occasions, migration can be actually a beneficial way of dealing with uncertainty. So migrants can cope with uncertainty through adapting via migration to unpredictable circumstances. So moving elsewhere in order to cope with the pressures of daily life. Finally, it's well known that migration can help people better manage the risks to themselves and their families and their households. Another layer of uncertainty surrounds the perennial question about the benefits and the burdens and the balance of the two. Right? And this is something that was so thoroughly examined in the UK in the September report of the Migration Advisory Committee for the Home Office. And these questions, the questions about burdens and benefits, if they're asked imprecisely, can be misleading because they mask vast inequalities between people and communities that benefit from migration and some who may not. And the answers to those questions also depend on many other factors, such as the state of the economy. The answer will be different when the economy is booming. The answer will be different when the economy is contracting. And here, an important follow-up policy question is how to spread the benefits of migration, how to share them more equally, but also how to share the burdens. And this question has not featured in the UK migration debate as much as it should, given its fundamental importance. One related issue is the integration of migrants. And we are talking about everything from basic language knowledge to job skills, everything that can help migrants participate in the civil life, in the civil society. And this is a key prerequisite if the benefits of migration are to be harnessed. What about control? This is also a hot topic, hotly debated topic. And of course, some form and some extent of migration control is inevitable, but full control can be an illusion. Over the past decade, since mid-2008, more foreign immigrants, on balance, came to the UK through the controlled routes, so from the non-European Union countries. And average net migration in that period from outside of the EU was about 190,000 persons per year. And that's significantly more than the number of people who came from within the European Union by exercising the freedom of movement rights, which the average of about 110,000 persons per year in the past decade. Why is that? Well, attempts to control migration do not change the fundamental drivers. So the complex web of underlying factors, vested, sometimes conflicting interest, and agency, what we've just mentioned a moment ago. Besides, migrants are already present in the destination countries, and institutions and sectors of the host economies rely on migrant labor. In several sectors, it would be very difficult to replace migrants in the short term, or it could be expensive to do so in a longer term. So for all these reasons, very unsophisticated migration policies and crude targets tend to be either inefficient or even, in some cases, counterproductive. And here, important lessons come from elsewhere, for example, from the United States. So selective enforcement of migration at the Mexican border, some parts of Mexican border, has unintentionally increased illegal migration, led to temporary mobility, what used to be temporary mobility becoming permanent, and also it fueled crimes related to human smuggling and increased the cost, both the financial cost and the human cost of being smuggled. And the recent European asylum crisis had similar elements to it too. So what does it mean to manage migration effectively? It means to confront the complexity and to avoid the illusion of control. So if we acknowledge that migration is uncertain and multidimensional, and it's a process that's neither intrinsically good or bad, if we do that, then it will be all the more difficult to fall into a trap of short-term, simplistic, and ultimately counterproductive solutions. On the other hand, maintaining the illusions can backfire. So unforeseen events can make all the attempts to control have opposite effects to what has originally been intended. Besides, many current concerns about migration, very high migration, ignore lessons from history. And to that end, in the UK, net migration used to be low or even negative, as recently as in the 1980s. And there was a good reason for it. The reason was, one main reason was the sluggish economy in the 1970s. And in fact, if someone wants to reduce migration, damaging the economy is a way to do it, because it's actually likely to work. But the problem is that damaging the economy to reduce migration, or to put it more generally, to trying to reduce migration just for the sake of it, whatever the cost, comes with a warning from the history. Be careful what you wish for. To finish on an optimistic note, what can be done, right? We talked about uncertainty and complexity, all the challenges, but how to deal with them. So there are very simple solutions. Some of those include contingency planning. So contingency plans can help alleviate some of the challenges, especially in the short term. One solution here is pooling resources to mitigate the short-term pressure of migration in certain areas. Making the trade-offs between various aspects of migration explicit can also help us scan the spectrum of possibilities. However, to do that, what we need is more information on migration, on its drivers, as well as more creative ways for dealing with them. And this is exactly why academic migration studies, including statistical and demographic modeling, can help. So we now know more about ways to combine different data sources to paint a more coherent picture of migration. We know how to assess demographic and socioeconomic impacts of migration. We know that there are some of the features of migration are actually quite stable, despite migration being so volatile. So, for example, the global share of people living outside of the country of birth. It's been quite remarkably stable, increasing only slightly. Currently, it's about 3.5%, just short of 3.5%. We know that the age patterns, the spatial patterns of migration are quite stable too. We are currently working on tools for quantifying migration uncertainty, just to give the decision makers additional information that will help them with contingency planning and stress testing of the policy solutions. Recently, we have started work on developing early warning systems for highly volatile flows, such as asylum migration. We are exploring new different sources of data, such as social media. And as the participants of the two-day workshop today and tomorrow will know, we are also looking to simulating, by using computer models, we're looking at simulating the complexity of migration as part of our ERC-funded Bayesian Agent Population Studies program. So how to make this work? To make this work, one of the prerequisites to make all these ideas permeate into the decision-making realm and into policy, we also need to ask serious questions about the state of the debate on migration. Because currently, the debate is unfortunately missing or oversimplifying quite a lot of features of migration flows. What is the case is that quite often there are promises which are being made that are difficult to keep, while the uncertainty and the complexity are being ignored, and so is the historical context. So, of course, getting uncertainty and complexity is not something that will help sell the papers. I think we need to be realistic about it. But still, what it can help with, it can help detoxify and demystify migration as a process and offer us a better and more realistic chances to make the most of it while mitigating the challenges. And this is exactly where academic insights on migration can help.
And John?
Thank you, Jakob. That was really full and interesting introduction. I just want to add a few points from my own perspective, really. Not really commenting on those points at all, but just some other things to throw into the ether. My name is John Simmons. I head up something called Migration and Border Analysis. It's kind of an analytical unit within the Home Office, within something called Home Office Analysis and Insight. We are one of a number of analytical units within the Home Office. We basically, my unit produces the Home Office immigration statistics. We do a bit of economic advice. We do a lot of social research on migration as well. One of the things we do, for example, is we're evaluating the Syrian refugee resettlement scheme that the Home Office is sponsoring. Do a range of different work. And there's a number of other units as well, some that produce management information, others do other forms of analysis, operational analysis, for example, and so on. So it's quite there's a lot of analysis and use of data that goes on within the Home Office. In terms of our understanding of statistics, Charles mentioned that kind of, part of my role is to kind of give advice to policymakers and ministers sometimes on trends in statistics on migration. We have, as you probably all know, I think, that we have two main sources in the UK. We have survey statistics and we have administrative statistics. Survey statistics produced by the Office for National Statistics, and the administrative sources, principally from the Home Office. DWP also produce some, and so on. Now, traditionally, as statisticians, we quite like surveys because they're under our control. We can design them, we can write the questions, can specify how they're run, and they're kind of safe for statisticians. And we understand about the estimates they produce and how to measure uncertainty in that sort of context. The way in which we measure migration is a bit more difficult than that, because the International Passenger Survey is not like a standard statistical survey. The design, if anyone, some of you may have been interviewed by the International Passenger Survey at airports, but the design is basically on it's a survey of people passing through a number of airports. It has lots of features which are rather unusual. It's a very big survey. It's about 100,000 people interviewed each year. When it comes to measuring migration in the terms that we discuss it in the UK, we're talking about long-term international migration. So we're talking about people who are changing their normal place of residence for more than a year. And out of that 100,000 people that we survey through the ports, only around 3,000 or so every year are long-term migrants. So immediately you've got a kind of really significant issue with the data that we're using in order to kind of measure and talk about migration. Some of the other interesting aspects about International Passenger Survey are around which ports do we survey in? What times do we actually run the survey? Does it matter? You could randomly sample hours and ports around the country, but actually migrants and travellers, people who pass through ports, are not randomly allocated. So, of course, if you're not running the survey, let's say overnight, you may miss a certain group of travellers that particularly like night flights, maybe long-distance travellers from particular countries, for example. Now, all of this has to be taken into account. It is taken into account in the design of the survey, but it adds to the complexity. One of the other interesting aspects of the International Passenger Survey, of course, is that it can, sometimes small changes have a significant impact. We saw that relatively recently with, if you read the Migration Statistics Quarterly Report published by the Office of National Statistics, you will be aware that over the last year or so we saw quite a step change or a drop in student migration, non-EU student migration principally. And we were looking at that from a Home Office perspective and saying, well, actually, this doesn't look right to us, doesn't look quite true, because we've got visa data that we can compare. And the visa data is pretty robust. It's administrative data, but it counts everyone from a non-European background who applies to be a student in this country. And we weren't seeing that change. We looked at the higher education statistics, and again, we weren't seeing that change. ONS looked at this change, and they agree with us, actually, and they've basically amended the way in which they describe the statistical trend to kind of not reflect the International Passenger Survey estimates, but for over this period where we think there's a kind of an interesting difference, to actually reflect some of the administrative data. It just adds to that picture of complexity that we have to understand in order to kind of understand trends in migration. Administrative data is the other source, of course, and that's what my team produce, lots of visa statistics, for example, and other sorts of administrative data. The thing to understand about administrative data, it's not in the control of statisticians, and this is a critical point, really. We don't design this particular form of statistical measurement. It's not a survey. We don't get to ask the questions. The questions can sometimes be designed around quite esoteric and strange policies and visa categories and things like this. They may not represent the sort of the picture of the world that we want to describe as statisticians, but that's what we have, and that's what we have to use, and we have to interpret it. It can be very complicated. And of course, administrative data is subject to lots of other vagaries. I mean, if you produce a count of statistics today, it will be different from the count you produce tomorrow, because it's a live database. It's constantly being updated, and so on and so forth. One of the interesting examples of use of administrative statistics, I think, is a set of experimental statistics that we published in the Home Office about a year ago on essentially lesbian and gay and bisexual asylum seekers. Now, we don't test people's sexuality, I should reassure you. That's not what this is about. It's essentially just a measure of people claiming asylum and whether they refer to their sexuality as part of their asylum claim. That's it. Now, there's lots of issues around this because this is not a standard category that is collected in data. It's based on, essentially notes in case files. So the caseworkers have to ask the questions the right way. They have to record things in a certain way for us to understand the data. There's a whole set of issues about how we kind of capture this data robustly in order to produce good estimates. But the other interesting aspect of this particular administrative data is not everyone actually needs to mention their sexuality when they claim asylum. If you're coming from Syria, why would you bother? Because frankly, your chances of being granted asylum are extremely high. There are actually 10 Syrians over the 21 months that we were measuring this data who mentioned their sexuality or mentioned being lesbian or gay or bisexual in their asylum claim, in the process of claiming asylum, I should say. And that's kind of interesting because, if you're trying to look at proportions and numbers and estimates and trends, this is potentially a big issue. So is the data useful when it has all these sorts of problems around it, all this kind of degree of quite unpredictable uncertainty? Well, it is useful, actually. I mean, the statistics show you there are certain countries where there are quite large numbers of people who are claiming asylum in this country on the basis of their sexuality. People from Pakistan, around 20% of the people applying for asylum from Pakistan. It's about 1,000 cases a year, or so, 1,000 cases over this 21-month period, were claiming and mentioning their sexuality as part of their asylum claim. There are some countries, and again this will be no surprise if you read the news, where quite a large proportion of the asylum seekers in the UK will have mentioned their sexuality as the reason for their claim for asylum. Certain African countries, for example. And again, this is informative. It may not be a good estimate of the overall numbers, but it's a very good estimate of where issues lie and problems lie that need to be addressed by policy. So again, it's just an example of how complexity in administrative data may seem to make some of the data impenetrable, or, I mean, you could skip over it and ignore it completely, and then you'd probably come to some wrong conclusions. But actually, if you understand the data sources, understand how they're produced, understand the context in which they operate, then, of course, you can learn quite a lot, and you can kind of understand and get a great deal of meaning from as I say, quite esoteric data sources. I think that's really all I wanted to say by way of introduction. But one thing that I just did want to just refer to, just to emphasize a point Jakob made, really, which is about the diversity of migration. So much of the migration debate, when you listen to it in the media, you listen to people talking, they talk about migrants do this, migration does this, migration has this impact. There is no such thing as migration. It's really important that you go away and you remember one thing from this evening. Whenever you hear people talk about migration, just there should be alarm bells ringing in your mind, because different types of migration have different costs, different benefits. They have different effects. They have different drivers, different motivations. There are lots of different types of people involved in this thing called migration that we talk about, usually in a very singular way. So if you remember one thing this evening, that's it. You know, if you hear people talk about migration generally, and we will do this a lot tonight because you can't really avoid it when you talk about the issue. But remember, we're talking about very diverse groups of people with lots of different diverse motivations. That's it from me.
Thank you. It's opened up a whole range of questions in my mind. And again, we talked before this evening about trying to define migration, and it sounds as though the definition is as vast and will change with each individual who comes into the country. I mean, I came to the United States. I migrated for love. I have to be honest. I wasn't oppressed. I wasn't coming from a poverty-stricken area. I wasn't in a war-torn area. I met a girl from England and I followed her here. And then 34 years later, I'm still here. And hopefully a meaningful citizen for this country and enjoy living here. But there are lots of other people who don't have that luxury and don't have that free choice. So how would we even begin to try and define migration?
Can I make a start?
Yeah.
Migration in some sense is very easy to define actually, because basically it comes out of population statistics. And essentially, population in 1 year, if you add the number of births, and you can count births, if you take away the number of deaths, and we're pretty good at counting deaths, and then you add this thing called net migration, you get the population next year. That's it. So essentially, the gap between changes in the overall population in a place, when you take into account births and deaths, that difference should be people coming in or out of the country. That's kind of it. So in terms of how you measure migration, there is a standard way of measuring it. And that's why, you know, when we define long-term international migration, we talk about people who change their normal place of residence for a year or more. Because again, we're looking at changes in the population between 1 year and the next. And it's just a really kind of stable, sensible way of measuring that difference. So someone coming to the UK, for example, as a visitor for 3 months, and then they leave again, has no net effect on the overall population. It may have a little effect, you know, while they're here for 3 months on different services and so on, but really there's no net effect. So again, they're not long-term migrants, we don't count them. People coming for a year or more, we count them. It's really that simple. So in terms of defining migration, at a global level, it's easy. When you start to break it down, and when you think about it, you have to break it down because of all the different drivers involved, different motivations, different sorts of policies you might want to introduce, that's where it becomes really much more complicated.
Yeah.
Yes, and I very much echo that. It's almost like we have 3 different areas, concepts here that we'd like to align. One is, what is the formal definition of migration? How do we define migration in a formal way, such that we can then analyze it? The other is what our measurement instruments actually allow us to measure, which is what John mentioned. You know, surveys allow us to mention something. Administrative data sources allow us to measure some other things. Some of the administrative data have not been designed with measuring migration in mind. That migration is just a byproduct of what they've been originally designed for. And then the final area is actually what are the groups of interest from the point of view of policy. So ideally, we'd like the 3 to align so that the formal definitions, the measures, and the groups of interest. But we know that this is not the case. And we know that very often for a single migrant, there can be a vast array of different motives, different drivers of migration. So it's not only that different migrants differ with respect to why they move. It's very often a single person has a range of drivers and factors that make them move or stay.
And in your introduction, you mentioned a few minutes ago, you referenced the fact that the migrants seem to drive the policy because of who they are, what their motivations are, what their reasons are for leaving wherever they're leaving, and motivations are for coming to wherever they're coming to. So how does that marry up with the possibility of making some policy decisions out of the data that we're collecting? How are we able to do that if we don't have so much of a definition from each individual person?
How do we define, I said before we started I wasn't going to mention students because that was the subject of the last one of these sessions, but I will mention them briefly actually, because they're quite an interesting case in terms of the debate about migration. I mean, most of the public debate is about higher education essentially, and higher education students. And, you know, we do measure that. I mean, we've got a higher education statistical agency that measures trends in foreign students. Our visa data obviously does that as well. But our visa data also covers lots of other people who come as students, not just in higher education. They may come studying colleges, sixth form colleges, they may come and study in English language schools. All of them need a visa in order to come here for the purpose of study. So the visa data covers a much greater kind of population than really the subject of interest that we want to have the public debate about. Generally, we may want to have a debate about some of those other matters, but of course that blurs the lines, because actually over the last few years we've seen radically different trends in the numbers of people coming to higher education, which have been going up over the last 6, 7, 8 years, and the numbers going to further education colleges, for example, where the numbers have fallen quite considerably as a matter of policy, as a result of actually tightening up the rules around that particular sector quite considerably. And of course, the subject that we're trying to discuss is not well measured or not well reflected in the statistics on which quite often public debate is based.
Mm-hmm. And my answer to your question, Charles, would be that we need to start from the policy question, right? What is the policy question that we are trying to answer? Then look across the available data sources. Is there anything that we may have at our disposal that will help us answer this question, even approximately? Or if not, are there possibly different data sources that can inform? And here is a matter for collaboration between the policy world and academia about bringing the different sources together so that they give a stereoscopic view on whatever we are trying to address. So I think I would probably turn the question back. So what questions are we really trying to answer? And what data we have, what data we might think of, what estimates we might think of working out or should follow from that.
And even within our own census, I know in the last 6, 7 years, there's been discussions about whether the census is valid, whether it should be a census, but I know that colleagues of ours from geography at Southampton were giving testimony in the House Select Committee and saying that 2 questions about residency, one, and my wife's a GP, so it was relevant to a conversation I was having with her, one was related to residency locally. Are you resident? Are you able to, do you qualify to be registered at that local surgery because you're resident in that area? Another was a residency question about, like me, am I resident in this country? Am I allowed to have residency? So even the same question being asked wasn't getting the same answer and didn't give us the same data that we needed, and the data was all over the place. And it's just a huge complex issue.
And different public policy questions, of course, will need different types of data. You know, there are certain things you'll need to know at a local level, which will be, radically different from things you might want to know for a national level. A classic example, I think, is how you measure commuter populations. And if you want to know the pressure on London, for example, you don't measure it based on the resident population, because an awful lot of people using services in London, of course, come from the commuter belt outside of London. It's a classic problem in trying to understand, where population pressures kind of lie.
Day and night population.
Yeah, as well, another good example.
Yeah. And also with it, sorry, did you want to go?
And especially you mentioned census, right? In the absence of a population register, I think the census at the moment is the best we get in terms of covering the whole population.
Yes, and there's certainly that discussion you were talking about, John, where the pressure on services, with the number of people who are commuting into cities which had inadequate services for health and also for fire cover, a whole range of things were kind of being discovered as these discussions around the census. But going back to the question we kind of touched on in the introduction about misconceptions around migration. So when we first started discussions about this event, I went to see Jakob in his office and we asked the really naive question, isn't this one of the most unprecedented times in history for human migration? Aren't there more people on the move than ever before? And Jakob just said, not really. Not really. And I thought, well, why am I thinking that? Where does that come from? So we have this caravan of people coming up from Honduras, knocking on the door of the United States, and Trump preparing the troops to meet them at the border along New Mexico and Texas and Arizona. We have people moving in and out of various parts of the Middle East and Northern Africa. We have a load of people. Actually, I was in Morocco not too long ago, and somebody said, well, there's the Algerian border today. It could be over there tomorrow, based on where the people are. And there's a whole range of different things going on in the world. So how do we kind of pinpoint what's actually happening and this misconception? Where does it come from? Is it the media fueling it? You mentioned social media as a new source for data. How will that help us?
Can I unpack the unprecedented first, because that may be quite interesting. Because even if we think about the recent asylum crisis, say Syrian civil war, the numbers that we observe are still not what happened in Europe in the aftermath of the Second World War. That was unprecedented in terms of the volumes. And if you look at the global scale, the share of migrants, as I mentioned in my introduction, the share of migrants globally is increasing only very slightly. And why is that the case? Well, of course, global population is growing, so the global number of migrants proportionally will be growing. As it happens, we do not have exact estimates of how people move between different parts of the world, especially in the developing countries. The data are just not there. But from the available estimates, even rough estimates that we have, we know that when we look at flows of people, relative to the global population, they have been remarkably stable over the past decades. There were interesting statistical quirks. So, for example, when the Soviet Union broke apart, it overnight created millions of migrants all over in the post-Soviet space. But this was nothing to do with people moving. It was the borders that emerged, and how people then started being classified as migrants in the international statistical system. But it's a different story.
Yes, of course, when Czechoslovakia split in two, suddenly twice as many people cross borders because of the nature. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, migration obviously has existed for centuries, well, forever, and it's happening all the time, clearly. A lot of people talk about the pressure from Africa, people from Africa coming to Europe, but of course, over half of the migrants within Africa, i.e. people living outside of their country of origin, are working in other African countries. Probably around half, slightly less than half, I think the estimates suggest, of Africans outside of Africa are coming to Europe. They go all over the place. This is just a natural part of society. Does that mean migration is not a problem? We should not worry about it? Well, sometimes it actually affects places quite significantly. When there was a lot of migration in the European crisis, maybe historically it wasn't the biggest number of migrants we've ever seen in Europe, certainly not. But in certain places, at certain times, it has significant effects. It has really significant effects for migrants themselves. So they're crossing in boats across the Mediterranean when significant numbers are still dying in the sea, and this is important. It has significant effects at the Hungarian border, if there are queues and queues of people that are stopping trains from operating, stopping the country from functioning. When there are camps at Calais and people trying to get into lorries, and people trying to run businesses to the UK can't actually operate because their lorries can't actually get through safely to transport goods. Of course, these are issues. Now, numbers are very small compared to historical numbers, but actually in that point, in that place in time, there is a significant issue that somebody somewhere needs to be addressing and thinking of ways of fixing that problem.
And are there any examples of places where there may be, you mentioned the United States in your preamble, is kind of having almost a backwards, unintentional result or maybe a positive effect of some of the policies it's introduced. But are there places in the world where there are some policies, there are maybe some forward-looking prospective countries that are thinking we're kind of ready, or I don't know, how could a country prepare for an influx of people?
Preparing's really hard, actually. I mean, one of the interesting things about the European migration crisis is that it moved around, and no one could really predict how it would occur, where it would occur. I mean, people may remember in the early 2000s, I think there were a lot of boats going to the Canary Islands from Africa, and that was the big migration crisis at the time, going to the Canary Islands to get into the EU via Spain. Then, of course, there was the problem across the Mediterranean, people coming from Libya in boats to Italy. That happened before the big European migration crisis. It happened at reasonably similar rates, actually, during the migration crisis, and it continued to happen for a period after the migration crisis. It's reduced recently, over the last year or so, for various reasons. But basically, that was a kind of a low-level constant, but very serious issue. Now, of course, if we tried to introduce policies that addressed only that problem, we would have missed the significant influx of Syrians and lots of other people, not just Syrians, that came via Turkey through Greece. That was a new problem, massive impact, just in terms of the reception of those people. On Greek islands, for example, the reception centres that were designed, were overflowing. We're not able to cope with that flow. And then, of course, if we focus on that problem and maybe built some massive reception centres and kind of, with whatever policy solution you want to introduce to deal with that particular flow of migrants, well, then we would have missed the Western Balkans issue. And lots of people from countries that were already inside Europe, that weren't crossing the sea, that were in the Western Balkans, then trying to enter Europe via Austria, via Hungary, and so on. And again, it became another big issue. So, migration problems and issues move around. They're very, very hard to predict. So actually addressing them in advance is actually quite hard. I think probably one of the most important things is to be alert to the problems and aware of them, and then to be flexible and respond quickly when they occur, and to have tools at your disposal that hopefully will work and support migrants and support the communities they're arriving in a sensible way. But you have to be flexible.
I very much echo that. This is something that also is coming out from the sort of cutting edge work in the academic migration studies. So the agility to be able to address the challenges as they come, and that requires having spare resources to allocate, right? And the resources, this is a political choice. This is a social choice. So this is not something that's given. This is something that the electorate at large needs to consent to allocating to a particular cause. You asked about an example, Charles. I think Sweden would be probably as close as it gets to that, because they have, in terms of dealing with the recent asylum crisis in Europe, per capita terms, I think they have taken more asylum seekers than anyone else. Of course, what helps them is geography. So they're probably about as the furthest remote country in Europe from where migrants come into the European Union. So Sweden is the last country on the route.
And
nonetheless,
going back to that issue of resources, you've mentioned a couple of times this evening about the fact that we need to, collectively share the burden and also share the benefits. So the big question is, how do we do that? But more specifically, is there something that can be done to either share the load? Who should be responsible, I suppose, is the real question for making sure that happens. Is it a collective amongst nations? Is it an individual thing for a country to?
You probably need to be flexible in terms of responsibilities as well. I mean, there are lots of interesting examples. I mean, I think one of the most interesting, which came out of the recent European crisis, really, was the idea of hotspot management, which, essentially the European community kind of invented in order to deal with these kind of unpredictable flows. And, essentially that was a kind of, a policy decision to set up hotspots to receive migrants, to record migrants when they were arriving, so they could actually be supported and kind of, processed more easily. But it was a flexible response to a problem which, I think we know from kind of the media, from the stories, there were very few migrants, hardly any migrants on the Greek islands prior to the European crisis. And suddenly, the migrants, arrived en masse some of these places, and it was really difficult to cope with. So you had to respond really quickly. And I think the hotspot process was one way of doing that. And that's not to say that's perfect. Far from it. I mean, there's still immense pressures even now in some of those places.
And to some extent, the crisis was and still is a crisis of coordination. So if you look at the European policy and the attempts to actually come with a solution that would replace the Dublin arrangements, and we're still nowhere near a workable solution. And the Dublin arrangements clearly ran out the cause, because what was the outcome of applying the Dublin principles is that the border countries in the Mediterranean were actually those who are the first that the migrants encounter on the route to Europe would, in principle, need to be taking the full responsibility for accommodating them. So that was clearly against the principle of sharing.
Yeah. I mean, Dublin arrangements are essentially the rule that basically says people should apply for asylum in the first country they arrive in within Europe, in the European Union. And that kind of works where people are flying in from places needing safety in relatively small numbers. But obviously, when you have very large volumes arriving in one particular country like Greece, it suddenly becomes pretty unworkable, really. It's a major problem.
And one last question for me before I open it up to the floor. And we kind of, again, discussed this before this evening about when does someone stop being migrant? So you've given the example of people coming to Greece. That's a first foothold somewhere to go somewhere else. We talked about, I mentioned the Hondurans coming up. If they make it across the border into Arizona, New Mexico, when do they stop? Is it when they arrive somewhere? Is it when they go home? Because we know a lot of people migrate to leave a conflict, but they don't go too far because they want to go home again. The ultimate goal for them is to try and return to normal life, I suppose. So when does someone stop being migrant?
I mean, migrants don't always know they're migrants, of course. I mean, they may not expect to be migrants when they just leave their home country and start travelling somewhere. I think, again, there's no single answer to this. It will depend on situation, a lot of individuals, and the reasons for migrating. I mean, one of the interesting aspects is, when would a migrant or a group of migrants, be considered part of the country they've arrived in? And that's really hard. We were talking earlier. We've all got migration backgrounds in various forms. Our families have, and so on. I'm sure lots and lots of people in the room have as well. At what point? I mean, I don't think of myself as coming from part of the world where my family originally came from. I think of myself as English, but that's where I was born. Being born somewhere, does that make you not a migrant? Not always, because it depends on how you're brought up and the community you're brought up in. One of the interesting things from, just referring, I suppose, to a piece of analysis we did with the Office of National Statistics based on the 2011 census data, we did a lot of analysis of the census data, which is published, looking at essentially the different socioeconomic outcomes of people depending on when they first came to the country. Because we've got this wonderful question in our census, actually, which is essentially the year of people arrived if they were born abroad. It's very useful from an analytical perspective in terms of understanding migration. And there are lots of interesting aspects to this, but essentially, the longer people stay in the country, the more they become like everyone else. It's kind of obvious, really. But of course, the speed at which people become more like everyone else varies for different groups of people in different ways. And it may vary depending on where they arrive in the country. So, I mean, housing is a really interesting example. Most migrants, when they first arrive in the country, will use the private rented sector. Not surprising. You're not certain about your situation, you don't want to invest necessarily in a house, you don't want to buy a house. Now, certain migrants with certain backgrounds, if they don't succeed well in the country, they may end up using the social housing sector more. Quite a lot of migrants actually, then want to buy a house, and much like the rest of the population, they end up, if they've been here for a number of decades, buying houses in roughly the same rate or proportions as the rest of us. And that's kind of the way it goes. But of course, it varies a lot depending on where they live in the UK. So one of the interesting differences that we discovered from looking at the census data was amongst Muslim migrants, people from Muslim background. People from Pakistan tended to essentially move up north, where actually the socioeconomic outcomes were quite poor. They wouldn't have a lot of money, but houses were very cheap. So very high proportions actually own their own home, own a property. People from Bangladeshi backgrounds tended to move to East London. And of course, we know what prices of housing are like in London. It's pretty unaffordable, so an awful lot of them are in social housing. Yet, actually, in terms of their economic outcomes, they tend to be a bit more successful, actually, much like a lot of people in the capital. So again, there's so many differences based on so many complex factors. It comes back to this, if you really want to understand what's going on, you have to understand these different aspects of the migration issue and different groups of migrants. You have to understand them in different ways and their specific situations.
And even if you look at it from a statistical angle, right, the answer is it depends. Because we can measure migration and define migrants in so many different ways. By country of birth, which is pretty much static throughout their lives, unless the country changes or the country changes boundaries. Or by nationality, but then what to do with people who are, who acquire new nationality over their life courses, or people who become, like myself, dual nationals at some point. So these are all the questions that, where the statistical measurement that we use does not really reflect the reality, and also doesn't reflect how people feel about themselves. So there's a lot of talk about the transnational communities. So not so much citizens of nowhere, rather the flip side of that. Right? The people who are at the same time in both places or in more than one place and feel attached to more than one place at the very same time. This is something new that is also something that has been quite absent from the discussions that we've been having. And in terms of where do you stop the migrants? Part of it is also to do with how migrants are being perceived, right? So using myself as an example, you can hear it from my accent. But if you listen to my son, who is now 7.5, you wouldn't be able to tell that he was brought up anywhere else than in the south of England. So this is probably where we can when we can finish the conversation part.
Next generation.
Next generation, exactly.
Yeah, my children are very English. When they go to the States, they're very American, and their language and the discussion. And if I start talking about baseball, then I'll go whole hog American. Thank you very much, both of you. Now we've got quite a lot of time left to allow you to join the conversation and give us your questions. And we've also, again, if you're watching the live stream, you can contact us via Twitter. Again, hashtag #UOSLectures. And I've got a colleague standing by to pick up your questions from there. So we've got a microphone, roving microphones to make sure we can hear you. So wait till the microphone gets to you. But who'd like to ask the first question? There's a gentleman here in the blue jumper.
Hi there. Maybe primarily to John, obviously. Very interested in the way you shared the challenges in measuring what we've had historically, going back to censuses of 5 or 6 or 10 years ago, whatever. How much is government prepared to accept that you actually would struggle to forecast, and to what extent are you able to use the lessons you've learned to forecast what, for example, let's put it on the table, a Brexit conversation may mean to migration? Well, I can imagine that's the kind of easy answer governments may be looking for.
Yeah. We try and avoid giving precise forecasts, I would say, because, I mean, there are a lot of people who think you can forecast the future, and we're really bad at that, particularly in the world of migration. But of course, that doesn't mean you can't understand some of the different drivers and how they might influence people. Usually you end up with a mix of different drivers, some of which will tend to make things grow and others make them shrink. And, you know, understanding the balance between those is actually a really difficult thing. So, but actually it's not necessarily unhelpful to have a partial picture. At least it's more helpful to at least have a partial picture than no picture at all. Mm-hmm. So, so you know, we can understand some aspects, but it doesn't mean we can tell you how many migrants there'll be in this country in 2 years' time or whatever.
So in forecasting literature, there is a saying, it's better to be broadly right than exactly wrong. And I think that very much sums, you know, our shared view on the topic. That it's, and different types of migration flows will have different unpredictability. So, you know, asylum-related flows will be very much high up at the far end of unpredictability. Whereas if you look at returns of British nationals to Britain, again, this is a migration flow, right? So that is probably as stable as it gets in the UK.
The gentleman here in the front. Oh, hang on just a second. We've got a microphone coming your way.
Hello, that was fascinating, thanks. In terms of being sort of broadly right and not exactly wrong, what is your sort of best prediction for the sort of the broadest trend over the next few years in terms of the numbers for net migration? And do you have, I really enjoyed the examples of sort of the nuances of different groups of migrants who are doing particularly well or less well. Do you have any other examples of that? I'm kind of intrigued by those.
I mean, integration is not really my area, but in terms of prediction, I would probably, my main message, probably would be that you cannot, as John said just a moment ago, you cannot do it in a strict sense. You can provide some qualitative insights into, okay, you know, some groups may integrate better than others. So there are indications that we could think of. But I think I would be very, very careful about not going too far. I think accepting our limits in terms of what we are able to say and what we are not able to say, I think it's probably, and being honest and you know, prudent about it, I think it's also part of what we would very much advocate in this area.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I completely endorse that. I mean, in terms of groups, other aspects that are interesting, I mean, I would, you know, encourage you to kind of look at the kind of work we did with the ONS from the census. There's lots of interesting insights there. But of course, they are based on the situation in 2011. They're based on groups of people, you know, at one particular point in time, and things change. So, you know, language ability for different migrants was really quite illuminating, I think, when we had the census data, because it identified certain groups that actually struggled with their English language quite considerably. Tend to be older women, particularly from Chinese backgrounds, particularly from Pakistani and Bangladeshi backgrounds. That does not mean women from those backgrounds struggle with English, because of course plenty of young women are kind of, you know, thriving and succeeding. So again, you've got to see all this stuff in context and understand it. But, you know, there are lots of insights like that you can kind of pick up.
Yes, we have this is from Twitter. We've got a Twitter question.
This one's from Vincent Kaimba. Professor Jakob, given the attention that migration as a phenomenon has received globally, do you see it as an uncertain and complex process in the future?
Yes, I think that, you know, if we are if we are to venture a prediction, it will be probably that migration will remain uncertain and will remain complex for the reasons that we were trying to discuss. There are just so many things underpinning it. And in a way, I think it's a good thing at some fundamental level, you know, because let's think for a moment, what would it mean that migration would be perfectly predictable? It would mean living in some sort of totalitarian nightmare that I don't think that, you know, none of us in this room would really like to find themselves in.
Well, also that balance we were talking about between the negative view of migration because there's been a problem, or that migrants are a problem, and migration just happening naturally. People, as you say, people come and go all the time, and the number of people that have probably entered the country today, I don't know how many thousands enter and leave, but it's a constant situation. It's not a threat or a problem in many ways.
Even, I mean, the evidence base is very, very, very uncertain, and it's, you know, even thinking about things like, you know, as Jakob was saying earlier, I mean, you know, migration is driven by differences, so economic differences between different countries. You know, people will migrate from poor countries to richer countries. It seems quite simple to understand that. But of course, a lot of people say as countries get richer, there won't be less migration, there'll be more migration. You know, this is a standard bit of the academic literature. You know, as the developing world gets wealthier, more people migrate. They'll have more ability to migrate. More people will have the ability to buy a plane ticket and go somewhere else. That's true. I mean, you know, there's a logic to that. But of course, how will they migrate? They may not migrate in the same way. If you're poor, you migrate once and you stay there. You know, you're probably not going to go home again unless you're forced to by you know, people at the Home Office or whoever. You know, but if you're wealthier, coming from developed countries, Americans, for example, they might come and work in the UK for a couple of years. They don't have to fall in love and get married. Maybe they'll go home again and they'll carry on their career. You know, developing countries, you know, could, as countries develop, it could generate a completely different form of migration for the same groups of people. So it's really, you know, this again emphasizes how difficult it is, even something as simple as that. You know, it's really difficult to predict.
And in a sense, it's easy to say that, you know, for a statistician, but I propose that uncertainty doesn't necessarily have to be something to be afraid of, but can be something to embrace. And, you know, as they say in the Scouts movement, be prepared. That would be the recipe here for managing it.
There's a lady here in the front, just there.
Well, thank you for your remarks. I've noticed that everybody seems to be talking about immigration rather than migration. I don't think that in this country we're very good at measuring emigration, and does that matter?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, again, what's the issue that you need to address? I mean, we've had a debate about net migration for quite some time now in this country, and of course that is a product of immigration and immigration combined. We've had issues measuring immigration. It's much harder to measure immigration than immigration. It's kind of easy to count people when they arrive in a place. They tend to have to do certain things, and you know, they might register for a doctor, they might register with a school. There's things they want to do. When they leave, they quite often don't bother deregistering. They don't tell you. I mean, there are some fascinating examples from, I remember learning about the statistics between Poland and Germany. You know this kind of story, but I mean, the numbers of people counted as arriving from Poland and Germany were about 10 times the number, you know, that the Poles identified leaving, if you see what I mean. You know, this was a few years ago, but it was a fascinating insight because it just kind of made plain that it's just so much harder to measure immigration. Does it matter? Yes, obviously we want to know about the overall population. You know, in terms of understanding about public services, for example, you need to know how many people are going to draw on those services. So you've got to have a good idea of people in the place and people who have left. But on other, you know, for other services, it may not matter so much. You know, people leaving schools probably doesn't matter. You need to know who's in the school, who's arrived, who's going to arrive, and so on. How many people are born and are going to arrive in the school, as well as people coming from overseas and so on. So I think, again, it will vary depending on purpose.
And to add to that, if you ask the sociologists, they would say that migration data are a social construct, and they reflect the social and political reality prevalent at a given historical time. So now there's focus on immigration statistics, partly because there's focus on immigration as such. But if you went back to the situation, for example, in the 1930s, most of the European countries didn't even bother looking at immigration because that was not a topic. The topic was emigration to the New World. That was what mattered. So countries were concerned about losing people to America, to Australia and New Zealand, and this was what counted. So what counts is being counted. Right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the other interesting aspects of debates at the moment is, I mean, there's increasing interest in circular migration. The Office of National Statistics recognise this as a kind of an evidence gap. So one of the things that they're trying to do is kind of use administrative data in innovative ways to try and fill that evidence gap, because we don't measure people leaving the country very well. We don't measure things like short-term migration and circular migration very well. In some senses, it didn't really matter quite a while. We didn't really worry about people who came and go. As I was saying kind of earlier, if they come for a visit, maybe do a bit of work or study, and then they go home again, doesn't seem to have much of a net impact. But actually, it can be quite important. If you work in academia, you might care about the PhD students that only come for a 9-month course, because they help pay your salary and so on. It's kind of, so again, it depends on the purpose, doesn't it?
Next question. Anyone? Yes, there's a gentleman there.
Well, I'm a long retired academic in the electronics field. What I'd just like to remark about and ask about, in the days of the Central European and Eastern European communist countries, the main issue for them was to stop people getting out. And some did get out, and they were generally welcomed, perhaps in the USA particularly, and sometimes in the UK. But these were people, for the most part, they were well educated in maths, science and engineering. When they got to their destinations, they made very great contributions and, as I say, were welcomed. We seem to have a situation now, and this is why it seems to be a bit of a paradox. The issue is now, at least in the public mind, how to keep people out. So people want to stop people coming into the USA from the south, want to stop people coming into the UK from various destinations. I was just wondering what your thoughts about this change in perception, where at one time, as it were, there was a wish to keep people into a certain area, and the ones got out to places where they were welcomed. Now it looks like it's the other way round. Thank you.
Who wants to start with that one?
Let's restart.
Where shall we start?
I mean, there's lots of different views, and some people may have that view that they want to keep people out. A lot of other people don't, and certainly government policy is not based on the view that we should be keeping out. As I said, migration is just part of life. It's about how you manage migration, not whether there should be migration or there shouldn't be migration. It's just about how it's managed and getting the right balance and creating the right incentives. And that's the subject for debate. That's why we should have policy debates about migration. I mean, every single country in the world, pretty much, has immigration rules of some kind, and they're trying to, they're all struggling with the same debate, same issue about how you balance, the various different drivers that are going on.
And part of the answer to that would be, okay, there may be a debate or maybe a discussion about the balance of benefits and burdens of migration or migration from certain countries. But then we have at the moment we have quite a strong evidence base behind it. I mean, the Migration Advisory Committee report, out just 2 months ago, provides a fantastic source of information for anyone who would be willing to read it. Admittedly, it's quite a long document, but with lots of attachments, but a very good reading nonetheless. And one fundamental thing that I think is also worth mentioning, that it tells something really positive, really good about the country that others want to move to. This is a flattery, as an American journalist once called it. And this is something that we wouldn't like to throw the baby with the bathwater here. So to make the country, turn it into a place that people just don't want to go. I mean, that's something that I would be very, very, very worried about.
And also there's something there about going back to the discussion on the levels of, well, not just the reasons why people have migrated or had to leave somewhere, but maybe the purpose. So some people leave and just go to the next available country or somewhere where there isn't the bad things happening behind them, and other people will say, no, I'm leaving here to go to Canada or somewhere because I think that's the best prospect for me. and they try to create that opportunity. Again, they're the people who obviously have more resources behind them or have perhaps more programs, but that purpose, that sense of purpose people might have in why they're leaving might be, I don't know, a factor in why they're successful as migrants or immigrants.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, people who tend to migrate further distances have to have more resources to do that, and they, you know, on balance, on average, they're probably more skilled, they've probably got more education, they're probably, you know, coming from more money background, and so on and so forth. Of course, there are, you know, there are other examples as well. I mean, the people coming from South America, aiming for the United States, are not well resourced. They're going a very long way to get there, but they're not well resourced. You know, so again, it comes back to understanding the particular groups you're looking at and studying.
But again, mixed in that group, they're likely to be very highly skilled people. And they're also
There could
people,
be,
but
yeah.
they're sort of, they're moving as a group rather than just individuals leaving and going from one place to the other. So the playing field obviously changes because of their situation.
But the same holds for many forms of forced migration, right? So many people will flee the immediate danger just to in the fear of their lives and the lives of the nearest and dearest. But what they do next, do they stay? I mean, take Syrian example. Do people stay in refugee camps in Lebanon or Jordan, or do they try to make an attempt to cross over to Europe? And to do the latter, you need resources.
You often don't know. I mean, again, if you're Syrian and you arrive in a refugee camp, you're probably grateful to be, you know, safe and secure in that refugee camp, and that's probably okay for a short period of time. But the longer, of course, that uncertainty exists, then of course you have to look at different options and you may make different decisions. And there's interesting aspects of this around climate migration as well, which is often debated. You know, a lot of people think that climate change could cause mass migration and be another kind of, another group of people who might be coming to Europe, for example, because it's seen as a safe place. Most people, of course, affected by climate migration, their first priority is just to make themselves as safe as possible. You know, and most people are not likely to be wealthy people. They're not able to get on a plane necessarily. So again, the priority is to make themselves safe close to home, close to where they exist. So it's not in any way certain that climate change will necessarily lead to mass migration. Now, of course, I could be proven wrong. There could be a form of climate change that will be radically different to that, and the migration results will be radically different. But
yes, but to put some optimistic light on it, there was a beautiful study here in the UK in 2011 carried out by the Government Office for Science on environment-related migration. A very comprehensive overview of anything to do with the interactions between climate change, environmental change, and migration processes. And one of the conclusions was that actually migration itself is not environmental-driven migration, even if we manage to define it properly. It's not a problem. It's actually a solution. It can be a solution to the threats to people's livelihoods. And this is something that the problem can be where actually people do not have resources to move, when they're trapped. That was the term they used, trapped populations. So those who cannot escape the progressively worsening conditions in their environment. And the same holds for forced migration.
yeah.
Take one more question. Anyone? There's a lady here in the...
Thanks. I think it's very difficult for those of us working in the migration field to give public talks and to engage in this. So I appreciate the efforts that the university's made and that you've done this. And I find it difficult myself from the University of Bristol doing this. I'd like to pick up just on one point about the mixed migration flows and the reasons why people travel towards Europe, and the suggestion that you made, John, that being in a refugee camp is a safe place, because I think that's very problematic. There are more than 2,000 people are known to have died trying to cross the Mediterranean just this year. Since the famous picture of the boy on the beach, hundreds, if not thousands, of children of the same age have died in the Mediterranean. So the people who are now in the hotspots are suffering very badly. In Moria hotspot in Lesvos, there are more than 9,000 people, and they don't have enough blankets. They're sleeping on wet floors. So I think that we shouldn't be complacent, and we should remember that the kind of society that all of us want to live in is one that has values and will address protection needs for children, for vulnerable teenagers, including the vulnerable young men who are often demonised. So I think we have a problem in the way that we mustn't slap ourselves on the back and say everything's fine. We need a migration policy that also is dovetailed into a proper protection and refugee policy, where we also deliver our duties as a just society to the people who are in grave danger.
I mean, I very much agree with all of that. I mean, you know, my reference was really about people, you know, if you leave Syria quickly, then finding yourself in a camp in Turkey, you know, may feel safe for a short period, but that won't necessarily last. And I wasn't trying to refer to, you know, people in the camps in Greece, for example, or anything like that. I mean, I think, you know, the situation in the Mediterranean, for example, is a humanitarian disaster and needs a humanitarian solution. This is not just about managing migration. In fact, it probably isn't even about managing migration to a certain degree. There may be migration management solutions to some of that problem, but fundamentally it's a humanitarian issue and it needs to be addressed in a humanitarian way. Some of the people getting into boats to cross the Mediterranean, you know, they are migrants and they've been migrants for quite a long time. You know, it's fascinating as an analyst to understand that some of the people, you know, who are getting to Italy and arriving in Italy safely, thankfully, you know, are from places like Bangladesh or Nigeria. You know, they're not from North Africa, not even from some of the more traditional African countries we might expect people to be sourced. And that's, you know, largely because they've been migrants for years. They've been working in Libya, and then suddenly they find the situation in Libya is so terrible, they can't stay there, and they have a choice. It's very difficult for them to go home, even though a lot of them would like to go home. And there were some really good projects supported by the British government, supported by the World Bank, to try and help people in those situations actually return back to the country they originated from. I don't think that's a negative thing. I think it's a really positive, and it's a really good humanitarian intervention. You know, they work to a certain degree, don't always work for everyone. Certainly, you know, they certainly haven't changed the situation for a large number of people who are still stuck in Libya. But I mean, things like that, you know, I think that's some ways that we can kind of help people. And it's not, you know, seeing migration to Europe as the solution, it's not the only solution, it's not the only answer. You know, there needs to be a diverse range of policies, diverse range of approaches that just support people to help them do the things that they want to do, which isn't always necessarily coming to Europe. It may be other things. But, you know, ultimately we want to try and help make them safe.
Yes, and I'm very grateful, Anne, for your intervention. I think that one of the key things to note here is that, you know, subscribing to maintaining the international humanitarian protection arrangements that emerged, especially after the atrocities of the Second World War, is not only a matter of political choice, it's also a moral choice. And how we do it, how best to do it given the resources we have, is another discussion. The main thing is that there is still the commitment to do it. And sort of remembering about this choice and this imperative, especially in a year like that, where we are celebrating the centenary of the armistice, right? This is something that we could have in the back of our minds when we are talking about issues to do with international protection.
So this conversation ends now, but I'm sure the conversation won't end because, like you, I'm sure I've got lots of questions, you've got lots of questions, you've got lots of things buzzing around in your head that you'd like to continue to talk about, and there will be opportunity to do that shortly. So would you join me in thanking John and Jakob for their time and their thoughts?
Thank you. I'm Professor Jane Falkingham. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Southampton, and I'm really delighted to see so many alumni here tonight. I'm a member of the University Executive Board, and so I'm representing the Vice-Chancellor here today. And I'm just really delighted to see all of you here and to welcome you. I'd really like to thank Jakob and John and Charles for a fantastic conversation. I think we've really gone across the full breadth of migration from labour migrants all the way through to asylum seekers. This is the second lecture in the series. We started the first lecture on international student migration, so a really focused topic. Today we've gone very broad, and the third lecture we're going to actually be moving out of Europe and into the developing world. So there's one more remaining lecture on Tuesday the 4th of December on population mapping in lower middle income countries, an innovative way to support the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, around the world, millions of vulnerable people are unable to access the most basic of human rights because, according to official records, they don't exist. So many people who don't have birth certificates, who aren't registered, actually don't have any records. And this means that governments in these areas are unable to adequately respond to emergencies or to plan for the future because they don't know where the people are and how many people there are living in different places. So researchers in the WellPop programme at the University of Southampton are revolutionising population mapping and accounting for these unknown communities for the first time. And as a result, aid can be supplied during natural disasters, more people can vote in elections, and vaccination programmes can be mobilised. And we're just going to share with you now a short video featuring Professor Andy Tatum as a preview for the next event, just to tempt you to come to the next lecture. So we'll just hear from Andy.
I mean, we see, looking at internal migration, we see those connections to families and sending money back in looking at mobile phone data, looking at where people are every day and over the course of a year. For instance, in Namibia, we see huge amounts of people working in the main city during most of the year, and then the holiday time comes along over Christmas, and the city really empties out, and huge numbers of people move back to the northern areas where they still have family that they're sending money back to, and they're working in the city for most of the year. And it's now these kind of data sources we can measure that and see it.
So if you're interested in attending the next lecture, please do contact our colleagues downstairs on the desk. It's taking place at the Royal Geographical Society, which is a great venue, but it's out in South Kensington, I think, so less accessible, or maybe more accessible for you if you're living in West London. It just remains for me to invite you all to join us downstairs for a reception so we can carry on the conversation. I should also say that as well as Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, I'm also the Director of the ESRC Centre for Population Change. And I just want to say how much we value this opportunity to interact with you and to talk about population issues. So thank you. Please do join us downstairs.